Assalamu alaikum to everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Greetings of peace to everybody in the room. I want to start by first, obviously, thanking all the organizers of this event for even thinking about me and my admittedly very small and humble contribution to this conversation. It's truly an honor to be here before you. I'm humbled, and I look forward to your thoughts and reflections on the words that I'm going to share with you today. I was telling a group of the team earlier today that I can't think of a more important project around Muslims anywhere in the country than this one here. And I think it deserves our full and unqualified support. It's a project that, had an archive like this existed, for me when I was doing my research, and I know many others, it would have made our jobs, one, much easier, but two, more importantly, I think, would have expanded the conversations around Islam and Muslims and social justice. And so I think we're very fortunate to be here in this moment, and I'm deeply appreciative of the team for having the foresight and forethought to be able to put a project like this in place. It's a small step, but it's an important one. And as they say, you know, slow motion is better than no motion. And I think as the ball gets moving on this project, it will only pick up steam and attract more attention, not just nationwide, but I think internationally as well. So again, I want to thank everybody for inviting me, but more importantly, for taking the necessary steps to make this ideal a reality. So I think they deserve everybody's attention. I wanted to talk to you guys today briefly. I only have about 20 minutes or so. And I was asked to speak about the legacy of civil rights and the relationship of Muslims to that. And you know, my book goes into much more detail, and so what I'll try and do is maybe give you not necessarily highlights, but pull out maybe a couple of maybe important points that I think might be relevant to the archive and some of the ideas that emanate from it. I think when we think about civil rights, I think it's important for us to understand and ask, well, what is civil rights, right? I mean, I think there's a way in which, for many of my young students especially, and even people my age, I am an older head, civil rights is something that's taken for granted, right? If we think about, what civil rights is, we have to ask ourselves, why is it such a dominant narrative? Why is it so celebrated, right? I mean, if we think about, for example, Obama's re-election in 2012, right? The day after the elections, the mainstream discourse on it was a product of the shifting demographics in the United States. Essentially, America was blackening and browning. And so according to the mainstream discourse, this was what clearly led to his victory, right? And of course, there's a lot of problems with all this, but I'm just giving you kind of the mainstream, discourse on it. But the idea was that, Obama won the election, right? The idea that a black man could be president in the United States was seen as one of the rewards of the civil rights struggle, right? This was kind of one of the fruit that the tree of civil rights bore for the American nation state. That's what the argument was. For people on the right, civil rights has been about colorblindness. We don't see color in America anymore. nor should we talk about it. In fact, to talk about race is itself racist, right? To talk about white supremacy is racist, right? And when in reality, what they're suggesting, the only color we're meant to be blind to is whiteness. That's really what color blindness is, right? We should not see how whiteness operates. But that's the right. The left, the Democratic Party, the liberals, I should say, celebrate Obama's victory as kind of the multicultural moment. They celebrate diversity. No, we should see difference. We should see and celebrate how we are all different, but we all get along, right? So on the one hand, there's colorblindness. On the other hand, there's multiculturalism. And I talk about in my book, these are both deeply troubling, right? And we can talk about why that is. But the bigger question, which is kind of the impetus behind my talk today, is what is civil rights? Why is it so important? Why does it have such a hold on the United States? I mean, if you think about what civil rights is, right? What was the civil rights movement of the 60s, right? What did it suggest about the United States? One, it suggested struggle. It suggested popular people struggles, social movements, right? People protesting. It suggested the ability of people to put pressure on the levers of the state and to seek redress through judicial, legislative, and executive decree, right? So in many ways, the civil rights struggle, as it's framed in this way, is quintessentially American, as the idea goes. And it's through these American norms and institutions that black equality, if you will, quote unquote, was achieved. So it's celebrated, right, as this kind of high moment in the United States. And again, like I said, if you fast forward to today around Obama, this is the same logic. Civil rights is what led to his election. This is why he can be president, right? But as we all know, especially in a post 9/11 context, what is it that threatens this kind of civil rights consensus? Right? What is it that celebrates this new democratic America, quote unquote? In many ways, it's the figure of the Muslim, right? The figure of the Muslim has come to stand in for threats to democracy the world over. The figure of the Muslim challenges and shapes America's understanding of who's a citizen and who's not, who's an enemy and who's not. It's allowed for the discourse on torture to be justified, right? The figure of the Muslim is also important in shaping ideas about gender and feminism, right? We treat our women better than they do, right? This is the logic. In fact, we have to go drop bombs over there to save their women from their men because we treat our women so well, right? This idea that gender gets played as well. So the figure of the Muslim comes to haunt questions around security, the increased militarization of borders, the police, drones, et cetera, et cetera. So this figure of the Muslim is threatening the civil rights consensus, but as I talk about in my book, this isn't new. The figure of the Muslim, right at the emergence of civil rights, and I'll talk about it, was there too, through the Nation of Islam and through Malcolm X. They were also seen as challenging this civil rights consensus or moment. And I'll get into that in more detail. But if we think about this, and I want to show like a little audio visual. I know for my students it's important for me to get visual on them because if I just talk, it could be, not exciting enough. But I know you guys are all different in here. But if we think about this figure of the Muslim, we don't have to go much farther than Obama himself, right? Those were the fears around him, right? We all remember, right? I can just go to, of course, the iconic New Yorker cover in July 2008, several months before the first election, right? You see it, right? Osama up above the fireplace in the White House, the American flag burning in the Oval Office. He's in the Galabea with his ship, giving a fist bump to Michelle in the kind of, she's iconically marked as Angela Davis-esque, right? So it's this kind of iconic, we got over on them kind of wink, wink, right? We're secret closet Muslims and black radicals, right? And of course, this kind of fear that he was a Muslim continued up until even August 2010, I talk about in my book, 2 years after he was already supposedly vetted by the populace. He was already voted in. Yet in August of 2010, a Pew poll found that 61% of Americans believed that Obama was a Muslim or that he might be. Now, I didn't say 61% of Republicans or the right wing or the Tea Party. 61% of Americans thought that he was a Muslim or he might be a Muslim. Right? So this continued to kind of haunt Obama. I mean, his middle name is Hussein. Right? Obama sounds like Osama, right? I mean, anything they could pull together, they did, right? And what I talk about in my book at the beginning is really this fear around Obama being a Muslim. This connection between blackness and Islam is really a deeper-seated fear in the United States around the legacy of Malcolm X. It's really the specter of Malcolm that continues to haunt the American nation state, right? And we can see it in all sorts of ways. How many people remember, and I talk about this in my book and I'll read very briefly, Dianne Feinstein's opening introduction to Obama when he was elected the first time. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday celebration, March on Washington, in the Washington Mall. Feinstein is introducing him, this kind of transcendent moment of political theater. And I remember watching this and my jaw dropped to the floor hearing what she said. Right? I'm just going to quote Feinstein real briefly. She says, quote, "Those who doubt," and I'm sure many of us, almost all of us in here will get the references, "those who doubt the supremacy of the ballot over the bullet can never diminish the power engendered by nonviolent struggles for justice and equality like the one that made this day possible." She went on to say, "Future generations will look back and remember that this was the moment that the dream that once echoed across history from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial finally reached the walls of the White House." Right? So here's Feinstein inaugurating the first admittedly black president. And in doing so, I got you, thank you. You're paying attention, I like it. Here's Feinstein invoking the specter of Malcolm through her reference of the ballot or the bullet. Arguably Malcolm's most iconic speech, a speech in which he argued black voting was futile, considering the constraints of America's so-called democracy. To vote, as Malcolm argued in both versions of the speech in Detroit and Cleveland, would make you a race traitor. You were a traitor to your race if you voted and participated in a flawed electoral system. Instead, Malcolm argued black people needed to look toward the third world and internationalize their struggles, to seek other means to achieve equality. But here's Feinstein at this moment invoking Malcolm to kind of exorcise him somehow from the national past, right? To say, no, it's King. We're going to celebrate King. And again, a 1963 version of King, not the 1968 Dr. King, who became more like Malcolm, unlike the consensus narrative which suggests that Malcolm became more like King after Mecca. In fact, King became more like Malcolm. King becomes the anti-imperialist in his Beyond Vietnam speech, one of the great speeches of all time. It's on YouTube. Listen to it if you haven't heard it, for you young heads. He says in that speech, America must listen to those that it calls enemy. Think about it for today. America must listen to those that it calls enemy, for they might have something to say about the United States and its policies. Right? Because if they don't, the epitaph on the United States will read Vietnam. Right? This is King 68, but of course, this is kind of whitewashed out of history. And so a triumphant narrative of civil rights of 1963 King is celebrated and held up, while Malcolm is also dismissed. Why? What was the problem with Malcolm? And why is a certain image of civil rights being held up? Civil rights didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a particular context, and I'm going to break that down for you for a couple minutes. What was civil rights? Well, for all of us who know, after World War II, there was a deep and vibrant black left that existed. Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Claudia Jones. A vibrant black left that existed that connected black people's struggles here with the anti-colonial third world struggles taking place in Africa and Asia. But by 1947, this split after the Truman Doctrine declared communism public enemy number one. The Cold War starts. And this fractures this black left. You know? Many became what we now call civil rights. Some remained part of the black left. Robeson, Du Bois, Malcolm, Lorraine Hansberry, a whole host of others continued to hold this black internationalist impulse. But the vast majority went on and became what we now call civil rights. What was civil rights? So again, we have to understand where civil rights emerged from. What did it mean to be part of the civil rights movement? Well, what these activists argued, NAACP, many of the big, what they call the big six, when they shifted over, we have to understand, what did they tie themselves to? They said, look, America, if you want to fight communism abroad in the third world, if you want to stamp out the commies, right, you need to do some work in terms of your image abroad. Those countries, Africa and Asia, are already very skeptical of white supremacy. They've been dealing with Europe for centuries. So if you go over there with your history and the blood on your hands, saying that you are going to be different than Europe, you're not going to have much support over there. You're not going to have much traction. The Soviets are going to win support of the third world. So you need to do something about it. So in exchange, this kind of quid pro quo happened. These civil rights activists demanded legislation, an anti-lynching bill, desegregating education, public transportation, etc. They said, your Achilles heel is how you treat us. And if you can show that you treat us well, then we'll support your anti-communist foreign policy. We will support your fight against the so-called commies. And for those of us who know, I hope, that for America, the Cold War and its anti-communist foreign policy was really about expanding U.S. empire. Anywhere where a supposed communist existed, Patrice Lumumba was named a communist. Mossadegh in Iran in 1952. President Arbenz was democratically elected in Guatemala and was assassinated by the CIA for fear of being a commie. And all other forms of destabilization because they might be communists. This was the argument. And this civil rights wing supported these policies. They presumed that the United States was a force of good in the world. Of course, as I mentioned before, this is what King breaks from. Right? What's his Beyond Vietnam speech called? Breaking the silence. He said, I can no longer be silent upon domestic civil rights. I can no longer be silent on U.S. foreign policy and only focus on domestic civil rights. I have to connect these two. I have to break this silence to the detriment of the civil rights establishment. So King ultimately breaks from it. But after 47, the black left maintained its criticisms of U.S. foreign policy and connected kind of domestic struggles around race with global ones. And Malcolm was a central part of it. In fact, he became the face of it because of his kind of public persona, right? And that's part of what my book does. It's really in many ways a prehistory to 9/11. It looks at how Malcolm X, the influence of Malcolm, and black artists and activists saw themselves not as a national minority, but as part of a global majority. Right? And they connected themselves to anti-colonial struggles throughout the third world. So that when we understand Malcolm and his legacy, we have to understand it as an internationalist struggle, not one that's domesticated, right? What I mean by domesticated is as much of the civil rights discourse went on and continues to be, right? If you identify with U.S. empire, then America's enemies become your enemies. Right? If your fate is tied to the empire, then you hope the empire does well. Right? And Malcolm and a whole host of activists and artists on the black left rejected this. They saw white supremacy as a global phenomenon. And Malcolm would talk about these in his speeches, Message to the Grassroots. He would talk about the same man that colonized Kenya and Afghanistan and Pakistan is the same man here in Mississippi and Michigan. Malcolm made these connections in his travels as well, meeting with world leaders. Speaking at the Organization of African Unity Conference in Cairo, Egypt, to make the claim that black people in the United States, the case of black people in the United States needs to be taken to an international court, because civil rights under the jurisdiction of Uncle Sam won't allow it. We cannot get redress here in the United States. It must go to an international forum. This is the United Nations in Malcolm's thinking. Right? So it's important for us to understand this tradition of Malcolm X, right? And to understand that, particularly, I think, when I wrote the book, and I was speaking to to Abbas and Bilal last night, one of the more consistent comments I get from people my age and older is, Brother Sohail, congratulations on the book. It's a great book. And all of a sudden, of course, I'm thinking, yes, well, you haven't even read it yet, but I know what's coming, right? I know something's coming. There's always the but. And the but is, but don't we already know this? Don't we already know about Malcolm and his internationalism? Don't we already know about how he influenced the black arts movement, and that was influenced by Islam, how jazz musicians were influenced by Islam, how hip-hop culture cut its teeth on Islam and black nationalism, and that was because Malcolm and his voice is the most sampled voice in all of hip-hop? Don't we know this? And I say, well, maybe. I know a lot of heads I grew up with don't know this. But I also know that for a lot of the younger heads coming up, they definitely don't know this. And for me, particularly when it comes to immigrant Muslims, they don't know this history. In many ways, they celebrate and reify a post-Mecca Malcolm. Right? Oh, Malcolm was a transcendent figure after Mecca. He stopped talking about race. He was colorblind. This is what the logic. He was about universal brotherhood. He was a universalist. This is the argument that gets put out about Malcolm. And as many of us in this room know, that's simply just not true. One, their position assumes two things. One, that the Nation of Islam was narrow and parochial, right? And it was caught up in this weird, quote-unquote, language about devils and gods and motherships or something, right? Heretical religion that was parochial and narrow. When, if in fact, if you read the early Muhammad Speaks papers, and you listen to Malcolm's speeches while he was in the nation, he meets with Fidel Castro in Havana. He invokes the Bandung Conference. He invokes the Vietnamese victory over the French at Dien Bien Phu. He protests Patrice Lumumba's assassination at the United Nations. All while he's in the Nation of Islam. So they're not parochial and narrow. They're internationalist already. And then, of course, when he leaves the nation and makes Hajj Mecca and comes back, he continued to center race within his thinking about how power and inequality continue to operate, right? Malcolm would say, and I just want to read a quick quote, because he ran into this even in Saudi and Egypt, amongst some of the ulema. They would say, Malcolm, you're talking about this race stuff a little too much. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. That's not what Islam is. And Malcolm was like, well, wait a minute. Wait a minute. And Malcolm would say, I just have a quick quote here from the book. Malcolm would say that the struggle of black people in the U.S. Is a responsibility not just for the continent of Africa, but that it must also be the concern and moral responsibility of the Muslim world, of the entire Muslim world, if you hope to make the principles of the Quran a living reality, right? I mean, this echoes, obviously, for those of you who haven't heard, like Sherman Jackson's recent kind of talk about quietism and acceptance of, and just kind of the quietism around white supremacy as a modern form of shirk. Right? To not critique and resist white supremacy is a modern form of shirk. It's idolatry. Malcolm was talking about this 50 years ago, after Mecca, right? And so it's important for us to understand this history, that Malcolm continued to center race and white supremacy, that social justice was a huge part of what Malcolm was doing, but not just Malcolm, the people that were around him, the OAU, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and beyond. And many of us in this room bore witness to that legacy and are living archives, if you will, of that history, right? And so it's important for us to understand the trajectory of Malcolm in this context. I know I'm running out of time, right? 2 minutes, okay? I appreciate it. I appreciate it. And so I wanted to kind of convey to you all this history, right, as I talk about in more detail in my book, about the role of Black Islam in the United States, particularly after World War II, and the way it connected its kind of liberatory impulses domestically with kind of international struggles abroad, right? It did it at the most fundamental levels, right? Of course, we all are familiar with, for those of you who aren't, so forgive me for all of us who are, but for those of you who aren't, what did the name change signify, right? It was a rejection of a kind of master narrative that whiteness had imposed upon black people. They changed their name from a slave name to the original name. That is to say that we have a history not just before the United States, but beyond the United States, right? It was both spatial and temporal. So it was a kind of dignified way of resisting at a very small individual level, a name change, right? How powerful that is. For too many of us immigrants, we just miss that. It's lost. The very kind of powerful ways that people resist in dignified ways, and I think this archive is a testament to kind of uncovering the dignity that is imbued throughout the history of Black Islam in this country, about how people not just resisted, because we want to give them more than that. We're not all just simply resisting. We live, we laugh, we love, we joke, right? That's also part of being a human being, right? Resistance is a central part of it, but resistance comes in many forms. And it's important that we become attuned to that. And so I think this archive is an incredible testament to this history. And I hope that my comments here today, if I offended anybody, I apologize. The errors are mine, not Allah's, right? The errors are mine. But if there's any insight that I provided a perspective for you all, I appreciate the time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. But thank you again. All right? Assalamu alaikum.